Hi, everyone. Welcome to this time of worship and Bible study. I believe this is week 25 of our shutdown. I was thinking this morning about the time that Israel spent in the wilderness and what a bizarre time that was for them. 40 years that they spent wandering in the wilderness. But God was still God, even in the wilderness. And I was thinking today, too, that even during this very strange time for the church, God is still God. The church is still the church. And isn't it wonderful that we have this medium to stay connected, to study the Word together and worship together? So welcome to everyone. Welcome to all of our church members. Welcome to family and friends who are watching. There's a story in the Gospel of Mark. It's in Mark chapter 9. Takes place right after the story of Jesus going up on the Mount of Transfiguration with his three closest disciples. You may remember that story that Jesus was on the mountaintop and literally his body was transformed. It was a mountaintop experience, to be sure. When he came down, he saw there at the bottom of the mountain that a giant crowd had assembled. The other 9 disciples were in the crowd. And when Jesus asked what was going on, it wasn't the disciples who answered, it was the father of a young boy. And he said to Jesus that his son was possessed of an evil spirit, that he had brought the boy to the disciples and asked them to take care of the boy, to heal him of this evil spirit. And the disciples had tried, but they weren't able to. Jesus quickly identified the problem of the disciples as a lack of faith. And he said that all things were possible to the one who believes. And in Mark chapter 9, verse 24, we read that father's reply. The Bible says that he cried out and said, "Lord, I do believe. Help my unbelief." I've always identified with that man. He had some faith and he had some doubt. And I feel that same way quite often. And I imagine that you do as well. Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. I imagine that describes all of us at one time or another. And so I want to talk to you today about doubt. The very first thing that I want to say to you about doubt is this. If you have doubts as a Christian, you are not alone. You may think that everybody else has it all together, that their faith never wavers, and that you're the only one who struggles with doubts and has unanswered questions. And I want to put your mind at ease today. That is not the case. Other Christians doubt also sometimes. The problem is we almost never talk about it. When I was in seminary, one of my homiletics professors, homiletics is the study of preaching, one of my homiletics professors used to say to us, when you get into the pulpit, preach what you know. People have enough doubts of their own. Now, that's good advice, and I've tried to follow it for 42 years, but I've always focused on part of that preach what you know. But there is another truth in there. I don't know how it escaped me for so many years, but it did. And that is the acknowledgement that almost everyone sitting in the pew listening to the preacher preach is struggling with doubt in one form or another. I don't know why I didn't figure that out sooner, because it's all throughout the Bible. Some of the greatest characters in the Bible were plagued with doubts. Abraham And Sarah famously doubted God when he told them that they were going to have a baby in their old age. Gideon, we hold Gideon up as a hero, that story of Gideon and the golden fleece. If you look at that story, the whole story is a story of doubt. God told Gideon that Israel was going to defeat the Midianites, and he was going to use Gideon as the instrument to do it. And Gideon did not believe it, even though the Lord told him to. And he asked for proof, and when God gave him the proof, he still didn't believe it. And so he asked Gideon, and he did that 3 times. 3 times God had to prove to him that what he was saying was true. There's the story of a devout and pious Zacharias in the temple there in Luke chapter 1. He was the father of John the Baptist, and like Abraham, didn't believe that God was going to keep his word. God had told him he would have a son, and Zacharias couldn't believe that God could do something like that in the old age of Zacharias and his wife, and he doubted. And his son, John the Baptist. You probably don't think of doubt when you think of John the Baptist, but he had a great crisis of faith toward the end of his life. And in fact, the sermon, I'm going to do 2 sermons on doubt. And by the way, that's how common doubt is in the Bible. I set out to preach 1 sermon, and as I began doing my research and preparation, I was quickly overwhelmed by the amount of material and realized that if I was going to say everything I wanted to say on the subject, I was going to have to do 2 sermons. And next week's sermon will be about John the Baptist and his crisis of faith. He doubted that Jesus was the Messiah. Not only in the Bible, but some of the most famous Christians throughout history have struggled with doubts. Billy Graham doubted the trustworthiness of the Bible. Mother Teresa doubted the existence of God. C.S. Lewis, who was probably the most famous Christian apologist of the 20th century, an apologist is someone who defends the faith, probably the most famous apologist of the 20th century, and he had periods of his life where he doubted the existence of God. Martin Luther, who began the Protestant Reformation over 500 years ago, at times doubted his salvation. His fellow reformer, John Calvin, wrote this, saying that doubt was so common in the Christian life that it was something that we should expect and not be surprised by it. And probably the most famous Baptist preacher of all time, the 19th century English Baptist preacher Charles Spurgeon, said this about doubt. When a man says, "I never doubt," it is time for us to doubt him. Now, what Calvin and Spurgeon, what they understood about doubt is that doubt is implied in faith. If you think about it, the whole nature of faith presupposes doubt. If we knew everything, we wouldn't need faith. We wouldn't need to believe. Hebrews chapter 11, which is the great faith chapter of the New Testament, says this, that the one who comes to God must believe that he exists. It doesn't say you have to know God exists. It says you have to believe it. And that same chapter goes on to describe faith as the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. So that's the first thing I want to say to you today about doubt, that if you have doubts as a Christian, you are not alone. Even if we don't talk about it, other Christians have doubts too. The second thing I want to say to you is this. Just because you have doubts, it doesn't mean that you are not a Christian or that you are less of a Christian. The opposite of faith is not doubt. The opposite of faith is unbelief. When you stop believing altogether, you're no longer a Christian. But just having doubts does not make you not a Christian. The most ready example of this would probably be that of Thomas. You remember he was one of the disciples of Jesus. In fact, he's so closely identified with doubt that that's what we call him to this day, Doubting Thomas. You remember that he didn't believe the resurrection of Jesus because he hadn't seen it yet with his own eyes. It wasn't enough that Jesus had told him it was going to happen, or that the other disciples had seen Jesus and said it to be true. Thomas hadn't seen with his own eyes, and so he didn't believe, and for that we call him Doubting Thomas. But that's not all the New Testament tells us about Thomas. There's a great story. It's in John chapter 11, where the Bible says that Jesus set his face toward Jerusalem. And what it means by that is he headed toward Jerusalem knowing that he would die there. He knew that he would be crucified, that there were people waiting to kill him, and that going to Jerusalem at this time in his ministry would mean certain death. The other disciples tried to talk him out of it. They knew that there were people there who wanted to kill Jesus. None of them wanted to go with him. None of them wanted him to go except Thomas. And Thomas boldly says to the other disciples, "Let's go, and we will die with him." See, just because Thomas had a crisis of faith, just because he had his moment of doubt, didn't mean that he was no longer a Christian. And in fact, after the resurrection, Thomas, according to Christian tradition, Thomas went to India as a missionary and gave his life for the faith there, was martyred for his faith. So even though Thomas doubted, he never stopped following Jesus. So just because you have doubts doesn't mean you're not a Christian. There's more. God can even use your doubts to help you. And this is fulfillment of those great words that Paul writes in Romans chapter 28, that in all things God works for good, that God never stops working in all the moments and events of our lives. God can use your doubt to draw you closer to him. Now that sounds like a contradiction, doesn't it? It's a paradox, but it is true. For example, doubts can make you examine and question your beliefs and your faith. Doubt, by its very nature, it makes us uncomfortable. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Once you start getting uncomfortable about something you believe, you'll begin to try to find answers to it. The theologian Frederick Beaker said this, that doubts are the ants in the pants of faith. They keep faith awake and moving. So God can use your doubts to make you examine what you believe and become stronger in what you believe. God can use your doubts to drive you back to the Bible. When you start doubting something as a Christian, probably one of the first things you will do is go back to the Bible to see what it says. Most of you know that my brother Ronnie passed away just a little over a month ago, July 25th. Ronnie was a very faithful Christian, a genuinely Christian, humble Christian man. And I know what our faith says happened to him after his death. I knew where everybody told me he was, but I started wondering about that. Where is he really? And it drove me back to the Bible, to go back and read those beautiful passages in the Bible about heaven, to read what Jesus said about heaven. And it reassured me in my moment of doubt. So your doubts can drive you back to the Bible. And God can use your doubts to make you pray more and to make you pray more earnestly. You're more likely to seek God in moments of doubt, more likely to pray, not just a rote prayer, but to genuinely pray from the heart. And so I know it's a paradox, but it's true that God can use our doubts to ultimately strengthen us in our faith. So that's the second thing I want to say to you. Having doubts does not mean that you're not a Christian. The first thing was, if you have doubts, you are not alone. And the second thing is having doubts does not mean that you are not a Christian. Now, here's the third thing, and this is the title of the message. What do you do if you have doubts? 3 things. Number 1, ask God to help you with your doubts. You know the passage we read a little while ago from Mark chapter 9, verse 24? I love the wording of it, the way Mark records what actually happened. It doesn't just say that the man said, dispassionately, I believe, but help my unbelief. The Bible says that he cried out. There was anguish in his soul. He knew that part of him believed and part of him didn't. And so he cries out to the Lord, I believe, but help my unbelief. This man, he didn't pretend that he didn't have doubts. He didn't say he didn't have doubts. He didn't say to Jesus, oh yeah, I really believe. He knew that he had doubts. And he asked Jesus to help him with his doubts. And so that's the first thing. If you have doubts, ask God to help you. Nobody cares for you more than God does. Nobody wants to help you with your doubts more than God does. And so you can be honest with him. God is not offended by your honest prayers. God will not be disappointed in you if you say, God, I have doubts about this and I need help. God will not be offended by that. God will help you. So that's number 1. Ask God for help. Number 2, find a safe person that you can talk to about your doubts. I've long been familiar with Bertrand Russell. Bertrand Russell was an intellectual back in the 20th century, very famous in the 1940s and 50s. He was a world-class mathematician, taught at the University of Chicago, but he was most famous for being an atheist. He was a virulent atheist, and even wrote a book, Why I Am Not a Christian, which is still in print today. I have a copy of it in my library. But Bertrand said this, and it was kind of a mean quote, but I want to read it to you because there's a kernel of truth in it that I want to point out to you. Bertrand Russell said, the stupid are sure, while the intelligent are full of doubt. Now again, Bertrand Russell was no friend to Christians. He was no friend to the church. But something he says in there is true, and I want to point it out to you. We, and I'm talking about the church, we lose a lot of young people every generation, a lot of intelligent young people who have questions because we don't know how to deal with doubt. We want to pretend like it's not there, or we make people feel bad for having doubts, like they shouldn't be having them. And when someone questions, we instinctively try to avoid that discussion. But it is human nature to have doubts about things that we can't see or fully understand. And it's quite often true that the more intelligent you are, the more doubts you're going to have. Russell understood that. We in the church ought to understand it as well. And we shouldn't be driving away intelligent young people, especially college age, because we don't know how to deal with their doubts, or because we're so rigid that we don't leave room for doubt. I wish more churches and more pastors would engage doubt in a healthier way. Every thinking Christian has doubts from time to time. We need to know that, and we need to acknowledge that. Now, I said find someone safe to talk to you about your doubts. I do not mean find someone who will answer all of your questions. That's never going to happen. A lot of questions don't have answers, and we won't have those answers on this side of heaven. There are some things that will only be answered for us in heaven. So I don't mean find somebody who has all the answers. What I mean is find somebody you can talk to and who will listen. That's what you need more than anything, is somebody who will listen. And somebody who will not make you feel like you're a second-class Christian because you have doubts. Somebody who will listen to your doubts. If they have some answers or insights to offer, they'll do that, but mostly who will just walk with you as you struggle with your doubts. So try to find somebody safe that you can talk to. And then number 3, and I really want to underscore this point, I really, really want you to hear it. Don't let your doubts keep you from trusting God. Now, again, I know that sounds like a contradiction. I know it sounds like a paradox. What? I have doubts, so that should not keep me from trusting God? Exactly. Don't stop trusting God just because you have doubts. I mentioned Mother Teresa earlier as someone who had struggled with doubts. Here was a woman who devoted her life to ministering to the poor and the dying in one of the poorest sections of one of the poorest cities in the world, Calcutta, India. Now, you might think that someone who lived that kind of a life, so devoted to God, would never have doubts. But Mother Teresa struggled with doubts her entire life. She wrote this in a letter that was published after her death, or in a journal rather. She wrote, "Where is my faith? My God, I have no faith. I dare not utter the words and thoughts that crowd in my heart. So many unanswered questions live within me. I am afraid to uncover them because of the blasphemy. If there is a God, please forgive me." Now that journal and letters that she wrote to other people, all of this was published after her death in a book that was put together after these journals and letters were found. Skeptics around the world used the book, the revelation of these doubts, to criticize her and to call her a hypocrite. I had just the opposite reaction. When I read some of those letters in her journal and realized how much Mother Teresa had struggled with doubt all of her adult life, I felt a sense of relief. Because I thought, my goodness, if this woman, such a devout Christian, so devoted to God, if she had doubts, maybe there's still hope for me in my doubts. So far from thinking her hypocritical, I was comforted by what I learned. Now, over the years, people traveled from all over the world to visit her and her little ministry there in Calcutta. One of the men who visited her was an English professor by the name of John Kavanaugh. Kavanaugh traveled thousands of miles to visit with Mother Teresa, and when he finally got there, the first morning he was there, she met with him and she said, "Why have you traveled thousands of miles to see me?" And he said to her, "I've come this great distance because I want you to pray for me." And she said, "Okay, what is it you want me to pray?" And he said, "Pray that I will have clarity." And she said, "I won't do that." And he said, "Why not? You have always had great clarity. Why won't you pray that I will have clarity?" And she said, "I have never had clarity. What I have always had is great trust." And that's what I want to encourage you today. That even in your doubts, even in your uncertainty, don't stop trusting God. You can do that, even with the doubts that you have. Now, next week, in the second part of this sermon, I'm going to share with you from this event in the life of John the Baptist, this great crisis of faith that he had. I'll tell you what happened there. And also, I'm going to tell you a little more about Mother Teresa, the advice that she received from someone that helped her to move past the doubts that she had. It didn't answer all of her doubts. It just helped her to keep going with her ministry in spite of the doubts. I'm also going to tell you about Billy Graham. I mentioned that he doubted the Bible. I'm going to tell you what happened in his life and how he was able to move past the doubts that he had and to continue on with his ministry. So I hope you'll be here to watch for that as well. Okay, as always, it's been such a joy to share with you in the Word today. I'm glad that you took time out to watch this video. I'm looking forward to being with you again next week. And until then, may God bless and keep you.